the making of West Side Story, the first time Leonard ever conducted that musical, has a very strange beginning. It really had a problem with the casting of Tony. In the beginning, before I was formally asked to do it, they'd asked Domingo to do it. Domingo's Mexican. And eventually he couldn't do the dates. And nobody really wanted to make this film. This is the film nobody wanted to make. I suppose if I always say that, West Side Story, it's the film no one wanted to make. And it happened, I'll go back and I'll tell the story again. It was a film nobody wanted to make, and it happened because the BBC signed a contract with Bernstein's management. And they agreed to make 3 films with him, 3 programs, 2 of which were high art, about Mahler, I can't remember what the other one was about, and the 3rd was a formal commitment to film every moment of Bernstein's work recording West Side Story in New York. Every single moment. Okay. So that was there, they'd signed up, they hadn't ever budgeted it, which was really foolish, but they hadn't budgeted it. And it was going in the ether, sort of being mentioned. Domingo couldn't do it. Then they approached Neil Schikoff, who is born in Brooklyn, would have been a really good Tony. And then he cried off. And for legitimate reasons, I'm not saying he didn't want to do it, he just couldn't make the dates work. And then Lenny said, apparently, well, get me that Spanish tenor I saw in London. And everyone went, okay. And everyone thought it was Carreras, and they booked Carreras. At this moment, I am sitting in Salzburg, having been sent by the BBC on the opera seminar, and I am sitting in a room with Lord Harwood, who's asked me to do a seminar on opera direction. And as I'm beginning, the door flies open, and this very imposing woman comes in and says, I think if you wish to put opera on television, you should show all of the action, all of the time. And then she walked out. And Harwood turned to me and said, did you know who that was? And I said, yes, that was Elizabeth Schwarzkopf. And then the phone went, literally. And it was my head of department. He said, would I like to direct the film with Leonard Bernstein recording West Side Story? And I said, yeah. New York, frankly, was more attractive at that moment. A week in New York, great, I'll do it. I'd do anything, really. Because I wasn't the most popular member of the department, because I wasn't very serious. I'm fundamentally proselytizing populist storyteller. And so I said, yeah, we'll sign up. So we go to New York, to Recce, and it's being done in the RCA building in the Avenue of the Americas, 6th Avenue. And it's being done on the 6th floor. And in order to film everything all the time, you have to have a truck, video cameras, the things that we know, that's the technique. The problem was, the only way into this studio was through a door, which you can still see in the RCA building, 6 floors up, which if you came out of, you'd just kill yourself. And you need lots of cables to go in. And you'd have to push them through the door, but they wouldn't allow the door to remain open with the cables through it. The only option was to make a hole in the wall, which really didn't go down very well. And they decided they weren't going to do that. So we sort of went away and we went, well, this is impossible. And we came back to London and we said, look, we can't, it's going to cost a fortune. American OB trucks are very expensive. And we actually can't physically do it. And then Fran, who you've met, Fran, my assistant at the time, said, well, why don't we do it on film? And we all went, you're mad. And then we went, oh no, that's actually quite a good idea. Because the archaic accounting procedures of the BBC meant that everything in film was below the line. So we wouldn't have to pay for the cameraman, we wouldn't have to pay for the gear, we'd probably just have to pay for the travel, the accommodation, and we were going to hire American Sparks. But we took a gaffer, Sid Green, with us, who was a fantastic man. And so suddenly it made sense financially. But the only problem was I was only allowed 180 rolls of film. Now each roll of film is 10 minutes. So that wasn't enough to cover everything by any stretch of the imagination. And But I said, well, I like a challenge. I'll be able to do it. I've never said no. I do have that self-belief that it's always going to be possible somehow. And then just before we go away, I go down to Glyndebourne because I'm directing the fantasy operas that were done by Ollie Nussin and Maurice Sendak, and were produced by Frank Corsaro, who's a very famous American producer. And Frank said, Chris, I hear you're working with Lenny. And I said, yes, Frank, apparently I am. He said, well, I got one word of advice, Chris. If you're working with Lenny, when he tries to kiss you, keep your mouth shut or he'll wash your tonsils. There's advice you're given in life, and that was some of the best, actually. So we go from that to actually the beginning of the filming in New York. Now, it's being produced by Humphrey Burton. Not a man I get on with very well, but that's okay. Anyway, he says, come out 2 days early. I say, oh, okay. And you need to meet the maestro. Fair enough. And then met him. And I fly out. And you know about time differences, etc. I fly out and I meet Humphrey, and he says, well, no, he's terribly busy and he can't see you, and you're going to have to meet him at 10 o'clock this evening at a dinner. Okay, I was like, bearing in mind that's 3 o'clock in the morning my time. So I'm taken along to this dinner, and Humphrey drags me to this end of the table, and there's an empty chair at the other end, okay? And the maestro's about to arrive, And in he comes, Lenny. It's always like that. And Humphrey gets up and he says, oh, Maestro, Lenny, this is Christopher Swann. He's going to direct the documentary. And he looks at me down to the end of the table. He said, Swann, which one are you, Odile or Odette? And I go, oh, Jesus. Because I don't do ballet. As a student, I could either afford opera or ballet. I said, he's asking me if I'm gay. What is the right answer? So in desperation, I say, a bit of both. And he looks at me and goes, okay, and sits down and we have dinner, okay? And then it's like, the best documentary making is like exploration, really. It's you know where you're going to start and you know where you're going to end, because everything has an end, even if it's the last day of rap and you'll sort of slit your throats. But what happens in the middle you can't control. I remember I was working with John Glenister, a very famous drama director, and I got to know him. He's Philip Glenister, and he's that dad of all these wonderful actors. And we were walking to the filming one day, and he said, Chris, I really envy you. I said, why? He said, well, when you get up in the morning, when I get up in the morning, I know precisely what I'm going to do. But when you get up in the morning, you haven't a clue. And he said, I just, that is the fundamental difference between drama and documentary direction, by the way. So we began to start, and Lenny'd never conducted this before. And actually, he'd never fully orchestrated it. Yes, he'd done the suites and everything else, but the show obviously had a pit band. And pit bands is a different orchestration to a full symphony orchestra, which is what had been assembled. Scratch orchestra from the best players Lenny had ever worked with, really. I mean, everybody wanted to work with Lenny. And I understand why. Because whatever you think about Lenny, whatever is said about him, he was a total musical genius. And there aren't many. And he had a love of music, which led to him wanting to pass that on in a very direct and passionate way, which is kind of rare. I mean, a lot of conductors ponce around being famous, waving a stick and not much more. But he had this passion for it all. And it began with this meeting of the cast, which was Kirita Kanawa, who was like a little girl throughout, Tatiana Troyanos, who I was impressed by, actually singing, what she called, Anita. And then Carreras, who hadn't arrived as yet. And then all the girls, the New York girls, Kurt Allman, who's the famous American baritone. And we all went to Lenny's apartment in the Dakota building. And it was just like, you know how jazz musicians have jam sessions? This was like a classical jam session. they were singing, they were dancing, it was extraordinary, and we captured it all. And one of the American Sparks, because we had American, clapper loaders, one of the American clapper loaders, opened an exposed roll of film. He shut it straight away, but you can still spot the green fogging on the bottom if you look at it. It was irreplaceable footage. I mean, you couldn't do that again. The studio we were going to film in was the RCA studio, was big, and I had a crew from the BBC, and I was very lucky because I had 4 cameramen. John Else, who went on to do movies, who I'd worked with before. Paul Wheeler, who had taught me how to direct at the BBC directing course, but also I'd worked with before. John Goodyear, who shot most of my documentaries, and John Sennett. And those, I knew all the cameramen. That was pure fluke. They were just the people available, because that's how the BBC worked. You didn't choose. You got whoever was on the bottom. And there was also, John's assistant was a guy called Terry Doe. And when we got there, we discovered we had 5 cameras, not 4. And Terry said he'd operate one. That made an enormous difference to it. So here you have a guy who's made lots of single documentaries, has discovered he can do multi-cameras as well by fluke, by chance, making a documentary that could only have been made in that way. There was a wonderful moment there. We were told there were 3 ring mains there, and John Else was going to light it like, you know, the Rock Follies, I think it was going to be huge. And then we discovered 2 of the ring mains were dummies. And so there was a moment when he came up to me and said, we can't do it, we haven't got enough power. I said, well, John, one ring, we should be able to do something on 1 ring main. And oh, well, that's impossible, it's impossible. He stormed off. And Sid Green, the gaffer, came up and said, it'll be all right, lovely boy. He said, it'll be all right, lovely boy. And it was fine. And actually, but it gives it a look. It's not highly lit. And that gives it this much more kitchen sinky feel of music making, which it was remarked on when it won one of its many prizes. And so we start off, Lenny's late. He was always late, but he always got 3 hours from the time he arrived. Don't ask me how he did that, but he did. And he was still furiously orchestrating with the 2 orchestrators he'd worked with before, Erwin Costal and Sid Ramey, I think he's called. I can never remember the names. And they were there constantly. And it was coming off the press, literally, as it flew along. We started off with a big group number, and it was just magic because everybody was on stage. It was like a huge bunch of kids. And you knew from the downbeat this was going to work.
Kid with the heavyweight crown. When you're a jet, you're the swingin'est thing. Little boy, you're a man. Little man, you're a king. The jets are in gear. Our cylinders are clicking. The sharks will steer clear. Cause every Puerto Rican's a lousy chicken. Here come the jets right up that out of hell. Someone gets in our way, someone don't feel so well. Here come the jets, little world, step aside. Better go underground, better run, better hide. We're drawing a line, so keep your noses hidden. We're hanging a sign, says visitors forbidden, and we ain't kidding. Here come the jets, yeah, and we're gonna beat every last buggin' gang on the whole buggin' street, on the whole ever mother loving street.
The problem was, if you may remember some while back, I only had 180 rolls. So in order to do it, I had to know when to be rolling and when not. And for 5 days, I didn't make a mistake. We captured everything in between what now you would just endlessly record. Those moments where nothing much happened, including the business in the recording booth with McClure and Lenny saying, I think we need a retake. That was a great end.
That's why I wanted to hear this.
Stop!
Now what?
I'm afraid we need a retake.
Yep.
it was just a matter of getting it all into the can. It was a matter of getting it all done, and we were filming away and everything was going very well. And then, of course, it all began to get a bit antsy. The first thing that happened was that Kiri started to complain about the air conditioning. Okay. And she said, well, I can't do this. And then Tatiana Troyanos started to complain about the air conditioning. Okay. So we had a diva face-off, basically, at this stage. So the schedule had to be then altered. And it all progressed until the moment of Something's Coming, when Carreras had to sing jazz. Carreras hadn't been there at the beginning. He'd flown in on Concorde and lost his luggage, which led to production trying to work out how to get him new clothes and how big his underwear was. It's a true story. And also, when Carreras first met Lenny, there was a moment when it seemed as though Lenny didn't know who he was. And there's always been in the background a sort of apocryphal story that wasn't the Spanish tenor that he talked about. I think it probably was, but it made a good story that it might have been Alberto Remedios. And I think the more that apocryphal story goes on, you think, really, maybe, you know. Anyway, Carreras, like a lot of classical trained singers, can't sing ahead or behind the beat. Sinatra can. If you're a jazzer, it's very interesting. I'm talking to someone not recently about this. If you're a classical musician, you're singing with the orchestra on the beat, or with the ensemble or the piano, and you're essentially following them. Essentially, if you're singing jazz, they're following you. And that difference, and I talked to Victoria Mulliver about this, who was in despair she couldn't play jazz because of the strict Russian training. And Carreras, bless his heart, couldn't swing. So we had endless takes of Lenny trying to do it.
If I can wait, something coming, I don't know what it is, but it is gonna be grand. With a click, with a shock, funnel jingle, up and over.
You're ahead of me.
Something coming.
You went to G major instead of F major. Take a break.
Take 10. Something's coming, don't know when, but got to move when at the will it be? Yes, it will. Maybe just by holding still.
Still.
I, to this day, don't know how they got a track out of that, but they sort of did. And so we got over that, and the ensembles were all going terrific. And I think one of the highlights for me was when he did all the dance music, and that, you know, the thing at the gym and all that. That was electrifying. And Lenny was having that much fun. There was one glorious moment where we were working off a thing in those days to synchronize the cameras called Rosie, and it was done off digital displays, which was synchronized. And one of the BBC cameramen had dropped one with a great clang in the middle of a take, and we thought, oh, that's it, he's going to throw us out. And then he stopped and he just went, BBC, and then picked it up and went on. And so that, by then we had his trust, I think. And then, of course, the second moment was the end of one of the days filming when they were doing Maria, and Carreras has to sing the top B. It was late, and we get to that moment, which is, you know, the moment. Nothing happened, and I've never seen Lenny. He just went, and Maestro, can I do this tomorrow? But the session's running out. And it sort of collapsed into sort of anarchy. Now, it was either then or it was at the end of Something's Coming, but Carrera slams the thing shut, says, Porco Dio, as he walks round. Lenny, the microphone picks up fucking tenors, which is in some of the versions, but not in others, depending which country it's been released in. But in a way that's magic, because everybody believes this stuff is easy. It's not. It's tough. It's really, really hard. And the people who are really, really good at it are walking a tightrope between success and failure every day of their lives. I've seen that with Pavarotti. I've seen that with Sopranos. Pavarotti in particular, is this going to be the last high C I ever sing? There's always that agony you can see in them. And then after that, Carreras came back and they did it. And it sort of hurtled towards the end. The kids came in and did the voices rather sweetly. It's Alexandra, and they did all that. And we'd done interviews, but originally it was I don't know whether I should tell you this really. It was going to be presented by Humphrey Burton. But I have this thing about not having presenters. West Side Story is a montage documentary, which is unusual. And I'd learnt the skill in radio, actually. It is just the telling of the tale through the people there and what happens. People don't, it's really difficult because you have to be constantly editing in your mind to know everything's covered. So you don't need that. And after that, we all went to the loo. You know, you really have to work hard. And basically, I cut him out because I thought the film worked better. And I'd learnt that from Barry Norman. Because I'd made a film about cats, the only existing footage of the original footage of Cats, which I did after Elton John, is mine. And we made the film, and Barry came in being told he was going to put commentary over it. And he looked at it and he said, "It doesn't need it. You do not need me." And I've always honoured him for that, because that helped everything that then came afterwards. So we get to the end. Lenny tries to kiss me, and I keep my mouth shut, and that goes well. And then the cameraman comes up at the end, John Elson, says, "You've got something extraordinarily special there." And I went, I suppose. I hadn't really thought about it. We've just managed to do it. We shot 179.5 rolls, and we'd done it. We'd done what was impossible, to make a film nobody wanted to make, which was supposed to be 50 minutes long. You want to know what happened next? So we go back to London with all the rushes and everything, and Francis, I go off and be artistic somewhere, and Francis then, my assistant, then details every single moment in the rushes, down to the finest. We couldn't have done it without this. So we had a Bible of every single shot of everything. And I was given a really wonderful film editor, Chance, called Howard Billingham. And what we decided to do was to edit each individual song together and each individual sequence, and then make a decision about structure. We had some interviews, Kiri going on about, you know, working with Lenny, it's like working with Mozart. Yeah, I think probably Lenny would be more entertaining off camera, but and then Trianis, I have a lot of respect for Trianis. She was really on the money throughout this. Carreras had talked. Carreras sort of, I think, got a bit bewildered in the middle of all this, and so I had enough material just to sort of, like pedal points, like those moments when you're playing the organ, where you just go, they put that in there. And we began to put this thing together. And at this moment, everyone in the world fled. I don't know where they all went. Humphrey went to America. My head of department had been fired, so he'd been replaced. And there was all sorts of things going on. And Howard and I, for 3 months of our lives, edited it and edited it and edited it. There was a wonderful story about taking the songs home individually. He took back home the rough cut of I Feel Pretty, and showed it to his wife, and she burst into tears. And there is something in Kiri singing that which speaks of her youth and her love of music and what's underneath the diva-ish personality. There's something there, which I think is wonderful. So we put all this together, and it's running about 100 minutes, which is about twice as long as it should have done. And we thought, well, you know, what have we got here? We've got something extraordinary. Not a thing you really said in the BBC, even to this day, really. They don't like the extraordinary. They're very, very happy with the mundane. So then the phone goes, and it's Humphrey in New York. Said, how's the film going? We've got a rough cut, Humphrey. Oh, right. Well, yeah, put it on some tape. In those days, pneumatics. Bring it over to America. I said, why? He said, well, Lenny's got to see it. I said, why? Oh, he's got editorial control. I said, what? BBC editorial control? What? Yeah, bring it over. We'll arrange the flights. So I set off for New York again, these 2 tapes. Okay, so, and I arrived and said, well, you know, at least I don't have to do a late dinner. This is a great relief. I said, well, what are we going to do with this? He said, well, you've got to come to the Amberson offices tomorrow. The Ambersons was Lenny's management. A man called Harry Kraut was his manager. And just bring them to the office and we'll show them to Lenny there. So I go along to Amberson's with the tapes. And I enter this room and it's packed. It is packed with everyone and their mothers come to see the rough cut, including John McClure, to whom, as I felt at the time, hadn't been particularly nice. And I go, I don't know whether I can swear on this, but trust me, I swore at this stage. I thought, well, what's going to happen? What? And Lenny says, Christopher, come and sit beside me. So I go down and I sit on Lenny's left-hand side. And we start to watch the rough cut, with me wondering what exactly I'm going to do with my career after this. And after about 10 minutes, he turns to me and he says, I didn't know you were doing this. It's theatre. And I said, yeah, maestro, it is. We watch all the way through to the end. Doesn't say anything. Gets up. And he says to me, I was harder on the tenor than that. And I said, you were. And I'd slightly altered the time sequence so it didn't look too appalling. I said, I'll tell us how, if you're happy, I'll tell us how it was. Yeah, do it. Oh, and one other thing. I want a shot of the double bass bows there. Fine. And I walked out of that building knowing I could then make the film I wanted to make. And that's all down to Lenny. It may have been a bleeding success, but without Lenny, it wouldn't have been. And without his compassion and sensitivity for someone else's craft, it wouldn't have been the way it was. So I scuttle back, cut it to 90 minutes, because you always cut too long, because you always leave in something the producers take out, which you don't particularly like, but they feel really good they've taken out, because that's an old trick. And we get it down to 90 minutes, and there it is, and it has to lead off the omnibus season. Nobody really was that interested in transmitting it, I would say, at the stage. It got no publicity, nothing. I beg your pardon, it got one preview in the Telegraph. Bless. And then it went out, got an audience of about 4.5 million, and all hell let loose. I don't think anyone had seen anything quite like this, and I don't think anyone would see anything like this now. I think I hit a unique moment in time when people were open enough to be honest enough about what happens when you're trying to create something. So then all this kind of maelstrom happens. There was one last moment when I met Lenny, when I was with Lenny, when they were putting on Marilyn Horne, because he got Kiri to sing somewhere, but Marilyn Horne does it on the recording. And for some reason I was left alone with him, and we were sitting, and he was sitting there, and we were just sitting side by side, and he said, you know, Christopher, West Side Story is the best thing I've ever done. And my tragedy is, I don't know how I did it. I've never told anyone that before, but that is what was said to me. And I think people need to know that that was the nature of the man. That whatever he looked like and whatever he felt like and whatever you think of him, he had as much self-doubt as anybody else. And that creation of West Side Story was also, he was very blessed with having Stephen Sondheim with him. And we know that there's more of Sondheim in the music than is admitted to, and there's more of Lenny in the lyrics than is admitted to, but they had a gentleman's agreement that they split it down the middle. It is a genuine collaboration between the two greatest composers of musicals of the 20th century, heavens above, and the pub quiz question is who wrote the book? And nobody ever knows the answer. It was Arthur Lawrence, but nobody ever knows who wrote the book. And the book is also incredibly important in any musical, but nobody ever remembers who wrote the book. So this sort of marked the end of that period, and then it led to me leaving the BBC, because when that film had gone out, I was then told by someone who should have known better in the BBC that it's all very well being successful, making successful films. They weren't going to give me anything to do for a year. It was actually said to me. I went, well, I don't think I've got much, why hang around really? Probably the best favour I was ever done. So I left, but then it went on, and I do come back to Lenny, and I do get to the end of the story eventually. It won the Prix Italia, but when we went to the Prix Italia, the BBC high-ups fled because there was huge criticism of the fact the BBC had made a film about a commercial recording. I mean, it sounds ludicrous today, but they were openly criticised for this. And Michael Cousteau, who was head of the jury, lambasted them and said this is outrageous. But then he said, we're not going to give it to the main prize. That went to Koyaanisqatsi by Philip Glass, which is a movie which is not what the Prix Italia is supposed to be about. And we won the jury prize, and we won the jury prize for the work of the team. And West Side Story is ultimately a team effort by all those people. I couldn't have done it without the editor, couldn't have done it without the cameraman, the sound men, I couldn't have done it without Lenny. And I went back to talk to Lenny much later. We talked to him about Walter Hussey, who commissioned the last film I made for the BBC, another famous film, the only film about Walter Hussey. It's got Henry Moore in it and Lenny and all these people that he commissioned. And Lenny talked about Hussey, and then finally I was at the Barbican and Lenny to see a concert Lenny was doing, and Humphrey Burt came and said, you've got saw us, much to our dismay, and said, you must come and see Lenny. And I said, well, no. And he said, no, I insist. Oh, well, I don't work for you, Humphrey, anymore. Anyway, we did go, and I don't think he remembered us, but he said that film reinvigorated his career and led to the flourishing, and you've probably seen the flourishing of his career as a conductor, particularly with the Vienna Philharmonic. It kind of brought him back from a point in his life where it enabled him to do some really great music making right up until his death. So I think I've worked with half a dozen geniuses in my life. It's part of what I wanted to do. I had geniuses in different areas. But Lenny was the true musical genius I worked with. And he was a man who, yes, he was louche. Yes, he was sexually all over the place. He grew up in a different time, in a different era when things were strange. He produced 3 wonderful children, or I think it's 3, who, what is so wonderful about Lenny is that his children have protected, enhanced and nurtured his legacy so well. If you read about the background to Bradley Cooper doing Lenny now, although that's really the story of him and Felicia, they've never put a foot wrong. And I've dealt with lots of estates, people trying to make lots of money. I think he would be so proud of his kids, the way that they've handled his legacy. They've enabled things to happen that wouldn't otherwise have happened, because estates tend to shut the thing down at the level it was. And I think that's one of his great achievements, is his kids from that point of view. And the other great achievement is to produce a legacy of all these other musicians, very great musicians. None of them, they kill me for saying this, none of them I think as great as Lenny, but very great musicians. And of course the tragedy was that he was going to do the three great musicals. He did Candide, and that was done in a concert setting. We did West Side Story in a documentary setting. And then he was going to do On the Town, and then he died. And I did that with Michael Tilson Thomas. And that, to this day, is probably the most extraordinary. I think that's even more extraordinary because it was done in 2 days at the Barbican with a cast to die for. And I just felt that Lenny would have loved that. He would have loved that, the completion of it. So that's sort of the story.